The night was dark. Steady rain and low clouds hung over the sea as the 1,100-ton square rigger Orpheus hugged the coast of Washington, searching for the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. It was the evening of November 4th, 1875, and the Orpheus was bound for the town of Nanaimo, British Columbia, where she would pick up a load of coal. Strong winds from the south hastened her pace. Captain Charles A. Sawyer knew the area well. Using dead reckoning, he estimated that they were nearing the Cape Flattery lighthouse, which marked the entrance to the strait. The captain and 6 or 7 of his crew stood on deck, peering into the darkness, searching for the beacon. This was by far the deadliest stretch of the voyage. Missing the light would send them into the rocks of Vancouver Island, a mistake already made by countless ill-fated vessels. At 9:30 p.m., Captain Sawyer turned the vessel over to Second Officer James G. Allen, while he went to his cabin to study his charts and review their course. He ordered Allen to turn the ship to port to avoid the coast as soon as he saw the Cape Flattery light. Not long after the captain went below, he heard Allen call out an order to change course. But it was too early. Captain Sawyer immediately went back on deck to see what prompted the order. Allen pointed to a light off the port bow. This couldn't be right. Cape Flattery should be off their starboard bow. As the ship turned to port, the light grew closer. Through his spyglass, the captain recognized the light was an oncoming sidewheeler. The change of course had put them directly in her path. The steamship was moving slowly, and she should have had plenty of time to change course and avoid the oncoming ship. But to Sawyer's horror, the ship kept coming. It was clear that it was going to hit. The steamer let out one quick blast from her whistle as her bow hit the Orpheus just forward of her starboard beam. Neither ship was moving all that fast, and the collision ended up being just a glancing blow. With her bow tangled in the Orpheus's rigging, the steamship swung around and the two ships struck again, side by side, before passing each other. Captain Sawyer hailed the sidewheeler, but he received no reply, and soon the ship disappeared in the darkness. His attention quickly turned back to his own ship. For about 15 minutes, the ship was overtaken by confusion, and the lifeboats were readied. But her cargo holds were soon found to be dry, and other than damage to her rigging, the Orpheus was sound. The crew gathered themselves and went to work repairing the rigging as best as they could. Captain Sawyer assumed that the sidewheeler also emerged unharmed and continued on its way. He had no idea that the relatively minor collision would spark one of the deadliest tragedies in the history of the West Coast of the United States. The steamship Pacific was conceived during a period of rapid innovation. Commissioned by Major Albert Lowry, Captain Nathaniel Jarvis, and William H. Brown, she was constructed at Brown's Shipyard at the foot of 12th Street on the East River in New York. While her size was nothing special, coming in at just 223 feet or 68 meters in length, with a beam of 33 feet or 10.21 meters, all amounting to just 876 tons, her primary selling point was her speed. She was equipped with what was at the time a state-of-the-art vertical beam steam engine manufactured by Archimedes Iron Works in New York. Equipped with a 72-inch cylinder and 10-foot or 3-meter long stroke, fed by 2 coal-fired boilers, her engines could generate an impressive 275 horsepower. This drove 2 huge side paddle wheels, giving the modest steamer a 16-knot service speed. While this would be quickly outpaced in the coming years, it was a considerable achievement for the time. She was designed to carry as many as 546 passengers in two classes, cabin and steerage. She would be operated by a crew of 52. Her accommodations were somewhat standard for the time, with individual cabins and a well-appointed dining saloon for cabin class passengers, and a large communal berth space and general area for steerage passengers that was probably not all that pleasant, even in the best of conditions. The Pacific was launched on September 24, 1850. The next day, she sailed a gala sea trial with a number of noteworthy people on board, including her builders and General Jose Antonio Paez, the exiled and future president of Venezuela. Part celebration, part sea trial, the event put the new steamer to the test. As she sailed down the East River, she found herself racing both the new steamship Franklin and the prestigious Cunard liner Asia. To the delight of everyone on board, her modest size and powerful engines allowed her to easily outpace the larger vessels. Her first voyage departed New York on October 11th with 80 passengers on board bound for Havana and New Orleans. Sailing for the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, she soon began sailing between New Orleans, Havana, and Panama. As the California gold rush gained momentum, the route through Panama became the most direct way to transport gold, general cargo, news, and people between the east coast of the United States and the growing ports in California. This was before the Transcontinental Railroad and the Panama Canal. These voyages proved lucrative. The Pacific frequently took on hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of gold and hundreds of passengers in Charges, Panama, which she would then ferry to New Orleans and Havana. The flurry of wealth and economic activity captured the attention of America's robber barons, who were eager to get a piece of the lucrative trade, which at the time was long and tedious. A more direct route would quite literally be a gold mine. The shipping magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt saw opportunity in Nicaragua, which was closer to the United States and could one day accommodate a canal system that could connect the two oceans. In 1851, Vanderbilt chartered the Pacific along with a number of other vessels to help establish this new route. On May 18, 1851, the Pacific began the long voyage all the way around the Drake Passage and up to San Francisco, where she would soon begin offering voyages connecting the city with Nicaragua on the Pacific side. Another ship called the Prometheus would connect on the Atlantic side and continue up to New York. The Pacific left for the first of these voyages on July 14, 1851, and arrived in San Juan del Sur, Nicaragua on the 27th. But the promise of a quick and easy passage through the country proved a fantasy. The shuttles that were to take passengers to the connecting ship were slower and twice as expensive as what was advertised, and conditions during the trek proved dirty and unsafe. It was so bad that when passengers finally made it to New York, they banded together and published a scathing review in the newspapers. Vanderbilt pressed on, but in the fall of 1851, the venture was hit with another setback when the Pacific's captain, David G. Belyk, died unexpectedly while the ship was docked in San Juan del Sur, Nicaragua. He was quickly replaced on subsequent voyages by the ship's first captain, Nathaniel Jarvis, one of the ship's 3 original owners. He would remain with this ship through February 1852. Despite the setbacks, Vanderbilt's team worked to improve conditions during the shuttle across Nicaragua. There was, after all, a strong financial incentive to get things right. These voyages proved immensely profitable. The Pacific and other steamships assigned to the route frequently sailed at full capacity and often carried a considerable amount of gold. But there's a reason why the Nicaraguan Canal never came to fruition. While Vanderbilt's operation gradually began to improve, the political situation in the country worsened as intense interference from the United States destabilized the region. Feeling taken advantage of, Greytown, a port at the eastern end of the route, demanded port fees from Vanderbilt's operation. In response to these demands, a captain from one of Vanderbilt's steamships took out his gun and shot a native boatman, murdering him in cold blood. When the U.S. minister to Nicaragua, Solon Borland, attempted to interfere in the man's arrest, local protesters, outraged by the violence inflicted on their home, threw a bottle at the official. Navy Secretary James Dobbins gave the town 24 hours to pay a massive sum of money in reparations for the incident. It was a sum that the small town was obviously incapable of paying. When the deadline passed on July 13, 1854, the U.S. Navy sloop of war USS Cyan opened fire, bombarding the town with 177 rounds of cannon fire. Marines were then sent ashore to set fire to any structures that survived the bombardment. The town was completely destroyed. Fortunately, the local residents already didn't trust the Americans, and they fled to the surrounding woods before the assault began. The incident, while largely forgotten today, was a major escalation in American imperialism and set the stage for much of the violence carried out in Latin America and the rest of the world that still rages on today. The resulting instability in Nicaragua led to a civil war in 1854, and Vanderbilt's assets were seized in March 1855. The Pacific sailed her last voyage to the region in August of that year. Still relatively new, the modest steamship's career was only just getting started. While the Pacific represented the latest technology at the time of her launch, she was almost immediately outclassed as steam power innovation raced forward at a breakneck pace. When her Vanderbilt chartered Nicaragua service came to an end in 1856, she mostly sat idle until she was purchased by the Pacific Mail Steamship Company in 1858. She soon began ferrying passengers between San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and Victoria, mostly fueled by the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush in British Columbia. In the coming years, she passed through several different owners. On July 17, 1861, she was nearly lost. Just after 2 a.m. while departing Portland, Oregon, she collided with Coffin Rock on the Columbia River, ripping open her bow. She quickly began to flood. Captain George W. Staples attempted to continue on to Astoria, but the flooding was too severe. The sinking ship drifted 10 miles downstream before beaching on the Washington side of the river, flooded up to her second deck. Her 70 passengers made it off the ship safely, and no one was harmed in the accident. Just a few weeks later, on August 2, 1861, the steamer was refloated, and by the end of the year, she was back in service. Demand for travel between the rapidly growing cities on the West Coast was high. Steamships like the Pacific, while clearly outdated, saw almost constant use. In 1872, she was sold once again to the Pacific Mail Steamship Company for $50,000. The next year, she underwent a major refit in San Francisco that overhauled her engines, almost doubling her horsepower. Over the next few years, she sailed primarily between Southern California and Mexico. But by 1875, the Pacific was the oldest ship in the Pacific Mail Steamship Company fleet. Badly outdated, she was finally taken out of regular rotation and relegated to the San Francisco mudflats. While it seemed that she was destined for the scrapyard, a new gold rush in the Cassiar region of British Columbia changed her fate. Once again, demand for passage north skyrocketed. The Pacific was put back into service, with 2 voyages a month from San Francisco to Victoria, with stops in Seattle and Tacoma. By November 4th, the season was coming to a close, and people were eager to head south to avoid the coming winter. All walks of life crowded the dock in Victoria, anxious to board the departing Pacific. 35 passengers already boarded in Seattle and Tacoma. Another 132 bought tickets in Victoria. Children sailed for free and weren't counted on passenger lists. As Captain Jefferson Davis Howe blew the ship's whistle, signaling their departure, a number of people rushed on board without tickets. While official numbers claim that there were 275 on board, it's almost certain that the number was significantly higher. David Higgins, editor of the Victoria British Colonist, who visited the ship before she departed, later recalled that her decks were so crowded, her crew could barely move around and carry out their duties. The true number on board will never be known. If Captain Jefferson Davis Howe's name sounds slightly familiar, that's because his brother-in-law was Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy. A number of other noteworthy passengers were on board, many with ties to the Cassiar mining district, as well as a number of working-class miners who came up north hoping to strike it rich. There were also at least 41 Chinese workers who were never identified. In addition to passengers, the Pacific carried 300 bales of hops, 2,000 sacks of oats, 250 hides, 11 casks of fur, 31 barrels of cranberries, 2 cases of opium, 6 horses, 2 buggies, 280 tons of coal, and 30 tons of miscellaneous cargo. And, most notably, $79,220 worth of gold, which would be worth approximately $2.3 million today. From the moment she left port, it was abundantly clear that the Pacific was barely seaworthy. The weather was gray and rainy, typical for the Pacific Northwest. While visibility was low, conditions were nothing a typical vessel and trained crew couldn't handle. Almost immediately, the Pacific struggled to remain on an even keel. In a truly extraordinary move, her crew filled her lifeboats with water to balance out her list. By 4 p.m., she rounded to Touche Island, clearing the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and turned south on the Pacific. Despite the stability issues, the Pacific plodded forward. Had it not been for one small mistake, she probably would have made it to San Francisco only a few days later. But one can only tempt fate for so long. Henry Jelly was a cabin-class passenger on the Pacific. Already an accomplished civil engineer at just 22 years old, Henry spent the summer in British Columbia working with the survey crew on a new portion of the Canadian Pacific Rail line. Born in Ireland, Henry and his family immigrated to Canada 9 years earlier. His trip on the Pacific was just the first leg in a long voyage back to his home in London, Ontario. Since this was about a decade before Canada introduced its own transcontinental railroad, Canadian travelers typically went south to cross the continent in the United States. Henry was traveling with his friend A. Fraser, who also lived in Ontario. From the moment the Pacific left Victoria, Henry knew that something was seriously wrong with the old steamer. The ship was dangerously unstable. Soon after leaving port, crew members raced around the ship, ushering passengers from one side to the other, trying to balance out the list. When that didn't work, they began filling lifeboats with water. First, they filled a boat on the port side to correct the severe starboard list. When the ship began listing to port, the plug was taken out of the boat and water poured out while they moved the hose to a boat on the starboard side. The spectacle left Henry convinced that they would never make it to San Francisco. But as night fell, he calmed his nerves, and at about 7 p.m. he retired to his cabin. He was nearly asleep when he heard a crash that jolted him out of his berth. It sounded like the ship hit a rock, followed by the sounds of something falling, like a bunch of rocks cascading onto the bow. Then he heard the engine room bell ring once, signaling the engines to stop. A moment later, another bell rang out, and the engines were thrown into reverse. He ran out on deck, but he found a scene of relative calm. A crew member told him that they had just struck another ship, but there was nothing wrong. Henry looked out into the darkness just in time to see 3 navigation lights disappear in the distance off the starboard bow. The night was quiet, and the deck was nearly empty. Since there didn't seem to be any immediate danger, Henry went back below to his cabin. He was about to get back into his berth when he realized that the ship had suddenly taken on a dramatic list to port, far more severe than anything he felt before. Then, he heard a strange sound. Rushing water. Quiet at first, but it quickly built to a rushing torrent. Something was wrong. He raced back on deck to find a scene of utter chaos. It was clear that the ship was sinking fast. Henry sprang into action. He spotted Captain Howell emerge from a cabin behind the pilot house and asked him if there were any blue signaling flares that they could use to hopefully catch the attention of another ship. The captain pointed him to the pilot house, and when he got there, he found a passenger at the wheel. The man desperately asked him which way it was to the coast, but Henry didn't know. He soon found the flares he was looking for and set off 5 of them. In the confusion, he heard the ship's purser asking the captain which of the 5 lifeboats he should go to. The crew had no lifeboat assignments and had never carried out a boat drill. Henry found himself waiting for a boat on the starboard side, but the craft was tightly secured to the davits and none of the crew could get it free. Giving up, Henry raced to another boat on the port side. Due to the growing list, the boat was resting on the deck as passengers climbed in, and Chief Engineer H.F. Houston struggled to launch it. Henry saw a number of familiar faces in and around the boat, including Freight Clerk T.H. Bigley, Purser O. Height, Quartermaster Neil Henly, the steward, Fanny Palmer, a young woman from Victoria who was traveling to visit her sisters in California, as well as Jeannie Parsons and her sister Alice. Jeannie was a well-known former actress who was traveling with much of her family, including her wealthy husband, Captain Otis Parsons. The young mother had to be dragged into the boat. Her 18-month-old son had already been crushed to death in the chaos on deck. As passengers climbed into the boat, they found water almost up to their knees, left over from the attempts to stabilize the ship. Henry was one of the last to climb aboard. As he lifted himself into the boat, water swirled over the deck. The Pacific was going down fast. Soon the boat was lifted off the deck, and the crew frantically slashed at the falls to cut themselves free. Just as the lines began to tighten, the lines were cut and the boat lurched free. The crew paddled hard to get away from the sinking steamer. But when they were only a few feet away, the overloaded boat capsized, throwing its occupants into the churning sea. It took all of Henry's strength as he struggled to the surface. He and 4 other men found the overturned boat and managed to climb on top. He never saw a single woman from the lifeboat resurface. They were all pulled down by their heavy clothing. Henry climbed on the boat just in time to witness the Pacific's final moments. Its funnel broke free and smashed into the water just as the superstructure began to break away from the hull. There was a massive explosion before the shattered pieces of the steamer finally slipped beneath the waves, leaving the screaming passengers alone in the turbulent waters of the sea that the ill-fated ship was named after. Soon large pieces of the wooden steamer floated to the surface. Henry and another man he didn't know, but probably a miner named Frank McCormick, spotted the pilot house floating by. They left the almost entirely submerged lifeboat and climbed onto the wreckage, which helped them stay out of the cold water. The night soon fell quiet. Frank told jokes about their predicament, which helped lift Henry's spirit. The 2 men clung to the wreckage through the rest of the night. Neil Henly was one of 4 quartermasters on the Pacific. Just 21 years old from Scotland, Neil was coming to the end of a long shift when he took the wheel at 6 p.m. on the night of November 4th, 1875. Despite the rain and clouds, the night was relatively quiet as the steamer continued on a south-southwest course. Second Officer Wells was in command, and Neil remembered that Captain Howell only briefly tucked into the pilot house during his 2-hour shift at the helm. By 8 p.m., their watch had come to an end. The 2 men were relieved by Third Officer J.M. Lewis and another helmsman. On his way out, Neil checked the ship's running lights and sails, which remained furled to their yards. Aside from a few passengers still lingering on deck and about half a dozen men drinking in the saloon, most on board had retired early. Many slept on the floors, even in cabin class, which was overbooked for the voyage. Neil was eager to join them. His shift started at 6 a.m. and began with loading cargo. Now, he found one of the only open crew berths and fell asleep the moment his head hit the pillow. The collision was slight, just enough to wake Neil and the others around him. The crew berths were in the bow and took the brunt of the collision. Neil was only around 20 or so feet from the ship's stem, but the sound was not enough to really startle him. But just as he was about to fall back asleep, water began rushing into the forecastle. Neil and the other men around him leapt out of their berths and hastily got dressed. When he made it on deck, Neil found a scene of utter chaos. Neither passengers nor crew seemed to know what to do. Many were only half dressed after water sent them scrambling up top. When he found the captain, he was still in his underwear. He shouted hard to starboard, but it was no use. A stoker soon raced on deck shouting that the fires had gone out. The ship was dead in the water. As Neil struggled to make sense of the chaos, he saw a series of rockets fire into the air. He scanned the horizon, but all he saw was darkness. He soon scrambled into a lifeboat, the same boat as Henry Jelly. But he too was thrown into the water when the craft capsized. Everything happened so fast. Almost as soon as Neil hit the water, the Pacific was gone. The night was filled with the screams of hundreds of people who were just thrown into the sea. But in about 10 minutes, everything fell silent. Neil managed to climb on top of a skylight that floated free from the ship. It carried 7 people, including Captain Howell, Second Officer Wells, a cook, and 4 passengers, including 1 woman. The captain told Neil that they were somewhere between 15 and 20 miles away from land. Not much more was said after that. Neil sat on the edge of the debris with his legs dangling in the water. As the night went on, the sea grew rough. At around 4 a.m., a large swell washed over the exhausted survivors. It took with it the captain, second officer, and 2 of the passengers, including the woman. Whoever she was probably the only woman to survive the initial sinking. That left just 4. A few hours later, the cook died and rolled into the sea. At one point during the day, when the fog lifted, the 3 men were able to see the coastline in the distance. They also saw 2 men floating on another large piece of wreckage, not too far away, but they were far too weak to call out to them. At 5 p.m., one of the passengers died. And early the next morning, the other passenger died as well, after surviving for 24 hours on the skylight. Neil Henly was left alone. Henry Jelly was one of the 2 men Neil saw floating only a few yards away. At around 4 p.m., Frank McCormick, the other man on the makeshift raft, passed away. In the night, as he lay barely conscious, Henry heard voices in the darkness. He realized that a ship was passing him by. He desperately called out for help, but the night kept him hidden from his would-be rescuers, and soon the unknown ship slipped away into the darkness. Henry was nearly dead. He had been in the water for 36 hours, when at around 8 a.m. on November 6, 1875, a passenger ship called the Messenger spotted him. He was barely conscious, suffering from exposure and severe injuries to his legs. But he was alive. The rescuers rode through the debris field looking for other survivors, but they found no one. Somehow they missed Neil Henly. But incredibly, 4 days after the sinking, at 3 a.m. on November 8th, the U.S. revenue cutter Oliver Wolcott passed through the debris field and spotted the young man, barely clinging to life. Henry Jelly and Neil Henly were the only two people that survived the sinking of the Pacific. While she emerged from the collision relatively unscathed, the night would ultimately prove to be the Orpheus's final voyage. Early on the morning of November 5th, only a few hours after she struck the Pacific and sailed away, Second Officer Allen spotted a beacon off their starboard beam. Assuming that it was finally the elusive Cape Flattery light which they had been searching for the entire night, he ordered a turn to line the ship up for the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Unbeknownst to him and most of the crew, the light was actually the brand new Cape Beale Lighthouse on Vancouver Island, several miles north of Cape Flattery. Having overshot the entrance to the strait by several miles, the ship quickly ran aground on Sardis Island on Barkley Sound. No one was injured, and the crew camped in or around the wreck until they were finally discovered and rescued by the Oliver Wolcott on November 11th. The same ship that picked up Neil Henly a few days prior. It was only when they were taken to Port Townsend, Washington, that Captain Sawyer learned the fate of the Pacific. News of the disaster only reached the town 4 days earlier when Henry Jelly was brought to shore. At first, many didn't believe his story, but it was confirmed when Neil Henly was finally rescued and corroborated the horrific disaster. Subsequent investigations into the tragedy determined that the collision was caused by the Orpheus turning into the path of the Pacific. While simple, this was an unsatisfying conclusion. Both ships, but especially the Pacific, were not traveling all that fast. A sidewheeler is better equipped than most any other type of ship to turn at a moment's notice. Henry Jelly testified that he saw the lights of the Orpheus after the collision, so the ship was clearly visible with properly lit running lights. But for some reason, the Pacific sailed right into the oncoming ship. Why will probably never be known. No one who was in the wheelhouse at the time lived to testify, and the two survivors were asleep when the collision occurred. Many believe that the ship probably did not have adequate lookouts posted at the time. Both survivors testified that nearly all of the crew was asleep. The Pacific did blow her whistle once, 30 seconds before impact, but no one knows if there was any attempt made to avoid the hit. If they did try to avoid it, they acted too late. The other question that perplexed the investigation was how a minor collision at a relatively slow speed could cause a ship like the Pacific to sink so rapidly. The steamer's bow crumpled dramatically in the collision. Ironically, Second Officer Allen of the Orpheus formerly served on the Pacific. He and others familiar with the ship testified that she was in very poor condition leading up to the accident. Allen even claimed that it was a perversion of language to call the ship seaworthy. Making matters worse, the stability issues earlier in the day suggested that either the ship might have already taken on some water in her holds, her cargo was stowed improperly, or the ship was overloaded. It seems reasonable to assume it was a combination of all three. The controversy led to calls for better regulation, but it was still very much the Wild West of steamboats on the Pacific coast, and the tragedy was soon forgotten. Captain Sawyer of the Orpheus was widely criticized for leaving the scene of the accident. He was never charged criminally, but the incident destroyed his reputation. He never captained another ship again. Despite the many unknowns of the Pacific's tragic fate, one thing was certain. The ship carried a considerable amount of gold. This made her wreck highly sought after, but locating the steamer would be difficult. No one knew the exact location of the disaster. The water in the area is deep and uneven, and the hull was almost certainly gone after nearly 150 years at the bottom of the sea. But after numerous expeditions starting in 1993, a team finally located what they believed to be the wreck in 2021 using side-scan sonar. In 2022, using an ROV, the team confirmed that they had indeed located a wreck site when they managed to recover a handful of artifacts. While it's not 100% confirmed, it's strongly believed that the wreck they found is the Pacific, due to the nature of the artifacts recovered and the nature of the scans, which indicated two distinct circles at the bottom, which closely match the Pacific's paddle wheels. The non-profit Northwest Shipwreck Alliance holds exclusive salvage rights to the wreck, and it's organized numerous dives to recover what they can from the lost ship. What they found are the final traces of the hundreds of lives lost that night 150 years ago. After his rescue, Henry Jelly returned home to Port Stanley, Ontario. While hesitant to return to the sea, he did sail to Ireland and back to marry his wife not long after the Pacific tragedy. He returned to his family farm in Canada and lived there until his death in 1930 at the age of 77. Almost immediately, Neil Henly went back to sea, and he eventually became a captain. He held a number of jobs throughout his life and settled in Steilacoom, Washington. He died at age 88 in 1944. Whether he spoke much of his incredible survival story is forgotten to time. His obituary only barely mentions the tragedy, which by that point had long been overshadowed by a long and colorful life. Thank you so much for watching. If you want more videos like this one, help out the channel with a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd like to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon and my channel members. Their support helps make in-depth, independently produced videos like this one possible. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Until the next one, be nice to people.